Welcome to Inside the Courtroom, the lori-vallow-trial. 5 weeks of testimony ended with a verdict on Friday. Guilty on all charges. So that is what the verdict came back after a pretty short deliberation. So joining me, everyone who has worked on this case, who has been in the courtroom throughout this trial, Alex and Shirah and Morgan. And we're going to talk about the verdict, talk a little bit about the closing statements and kind of the reaction, plus what's next, because this is just the very first step. And it's a big one, of course, but still a lot to come in this trial or in this, against lori-vallow. But also we have to talk about what's next for Chad Daybell, because there is an entire trial to go there. And then also potential additional charges for Lori in other states, so in Arizona. So let's talk first about what happened on Friday. We all watched and we all listened to that verdict come in. Let's give a little bit of history. So Thursday afternoon, the jury went in after closing arguments, went into deliberation. And we know that once you go into deliberation, it doesn't happen immediately. They have to pick a foreman. They had to determine who the actual jurors were and who the alternates were. And then they can get started on actual discussion about all of those charges. And they have to come to a unanimous decision on every single one. And those have to be, as the judge explained, those have to be independent thoughts. This isn't, as a juror, you don't go in to try to convince someone of a verdict, but you have to have that thought on your own. And then they came back out after having overnight.
7 hours total.
Is that what it was?
Just near 7 hours, and they got their lunch, and then right after lunch was when the verdict came in, and I was thinking, they would be smart to get that free lunch and then come back with their decision, which is what exactly happened. And it's funny because I was actually at lunch and I was walking down the street back to the courthouse, and all of the police officers from Rexburg and Fremont County were with Prosecutor Lindsay Blake, and they all stopped on the corner of the street and just looked frozen. And I was like, I don't know what's going on. And I look at the reporter next to me and I said, I don't know. I think there was a verdict because Lindsay Blake got a phone call and she looked like a little bit ghost white. And I said, I think that was the verdict. And then we just, we were like, maybe it's not. And we walked past. And then as soon as we get into that courtroom, we heard there was a verdict. So, it was pretty quick. And honestly, I think that they could have come to their decision a little bit earlier, but if they did bring that to the judge always has a right to say, hey, keep thinking about it.
Yeah, sure.
He can do that. And so maybe it just maybe they did have a decision that day, but they kind of wanted to keep talking about it and making sure that they were really, really solid in what they came to.
Yeah, and I was surprised they didn't have any questions. That's not unusual, especially when you're considering multiple charges. It's not unusual to have them come back and ask for a clarification on a law, have them ask for clarification on the rules, but that didn't happen. And so they seemed, it seemed very succinct.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting about, this case in particular, as we've seen play out, there was so much. There was so much evidence. There was so much witness testimony, about 60 witnesses who testified in this case. Jurors were taking notes, some of them. Others just were going off of their memory. And so ultimately they had the 18 sitting on the jury throughout the trial, and then the 12 were randomly chosen come the day of deliberation. And so these are people, just like you and me, that are sitting here absorbing the most horrific stuff, some really complex information that is not chronological, hearing from witnesses that are talking about 2020 to 2019 to 2023, and they made that decision so quickly.
Yeah, and what's interesting is they weren't able to talk about any of this until they were deliberating, and they're all together, right? So, I'm not going to lie, I wish I could have been in that room
to be a fly on the wall.
Right, to hear those conversations that we're having. And, and I know all of us had thoughts after every day of testimony, so you can only imagine after 5 weeks to come together and finally get to talk about this with someone else.
Right.
It's a lot.
Well, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that during the verdict, those alternate jurors were actually allowed into the room, and it's like, as they should be, because they spent the same amount of time as everyone else, and they probably deserve to listen to what their fellow jurors came to. So I think that it was really cool to see those alternate jurors back in the courtroom.
And just to touch on the verdict itself for those that haven't exactly known what exactly the charges were. So it's first-degree murder of Tylee Ryan, conspiracy to commit murder and theft in relation to Tylee Ryan, first-degree murder of J.J. Vallow, conspiracy to commit murder and theft with J.J. Vallow, and that all relates to Social Security benefits and the money that J.J. and Tylee were receiving from deceased parents of their own, and as well as conspiracy to commit murder and grand theft with Tammy Daybell, her current husband's late wife.
Right.
So all those charges, there were technically 6 charges, 7 counts. One of them got removed along the way, and she was found guilty on all of them. And I think I can speak for all of us, was when that first guilty verdict came down, that was conspiracy to commit murder with Tylee.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, that track, you know,
Right.
it wasn't surprising to me, and I think we talked to a lot of pundits, you included, Gene Fisher, the former Ada County prosecutor, who said it wouldn't be surprising if she was found guilty on conspiracy. Now, the first-degree murder charge,
Right.
that may be a different story. So we were all not very surprised, and then that first-degree murder charge guilty verdict came down, and that was, I think, what was like the deep breath a lot of people
Yeah.
were waiting for.
And I think it's important to remember that in Idaho, that doesn't, by law, what that means is that you knew it was going to
Exactly.
happen. You did nothing to stop it. It does not mean that you had to have been the person physically responsible for the death.
You can
Exactly.
encourage or command it.
Right.
You don't have to be there.
Exactly.
And so all the jury needed to hear was that she encouraged it. And
Right.
if they came to that conclusion and that's what that's how that happened, then they would have, made
Yeah.
that decision, found her guilty, but that's all you have to figure out. So
Yeah.
And the Tammy verdict, the charge related to Tammy Daybell's death, that was the one. I mean, once I heard the guilty on the children, I felt very comfortable with, if one were going to be guilty, she was going to be guilty, found guilty on the other one. But the one I still, at the end of the day, I still had a question about, which would have been the conspiracy to commit murder against Tammy Daybell.
Right, because again, she wasn't even there.
Right, yeah.
And she was out of town,
She was in Hawaii, right? Yeah.
And so that was a big part of this too, was
Yeah.
I think a lot of people were waiting. And at the news conference that the Woodcocks held, JJ's grandparents, right after court ended, or we got that verdict, I mean, even Kay said, we weren't sure if we were going to get all these guilty charges or guilty verdicts, but they did, and so it was, they were saying they were elated. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's been more than 3 years, nearly 4 years to get to that point. So you
if you
definitely feel for them.
include July of
Yeah.
2019, it would be basically 4 years almost.
Right.
From Charles'
for
death.
Charles, like
Yeah.
the whole, and the catalyst, like Brandon
Sure.
and all that stuff.
right.
So,
Yeah.
so it's almost a 4-year case.
And you were
long journey.
in the courtroom. We'll talk about that jubilation. It was a celebration outside the courtroom. But in the courtroom, obviously the judge very clear on his instructions that there is a decorum and that you will follow that, and that we will not have any outbursts or any sort of celebration in the courtroom or response in any way. So what did you see sitting in the courtroom as the verdict was read?
I think I expected people to make noise because there was a lot of people in there that were very attached to this case. People who have followed it since the beginning, even just people with their own kids that decided to come and watch the verdict. Like, I seriously thought that there were going to be at least some noises, but it turned out to be like so tense in there that you could just feel your skin crawl almost. Like, the reporters next to me, they said my hands are shaking, my heart is pounding, and like I was sweating, and the air was just so tense. It just felt like you could cut, like I put it in my story, you could just cut it with a knife. It was just so quiet. And I think that because this has lasted so long and this trial lasted so long, I think that everyone knew like when to be quiet and when to just be respectful. And everyone wanted to hear for themselves with their own ears that verdict. And when, like the first one, like Morgan was saying, I wasn't too shocked, but as the clerk just kept saying guilty, 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 everyone was like breathing just sighs. Like, I could hear sighs next to me. I could hear like, or I could see people wiping their faces, people like, getting a little nasally. Kay and Larry were crying. Some of the officers were like looking up, like I couldn't tell if they were crying. It appeared to be like they looked a little bit emotional, but I couldn't exactly like make that determination.
And what about Lori?
Yeah, nothing. Like, I know she had her hands out in front of her for a little while. She had her lips pursed. She was looking at the clerk most of the time. She actually, I was talking with another reporter. It did look like she was glaring at the jury after they were affirming their decision, but one by one. Like, it looked like she was very, very angry. But not in a way, like, I can't make that determination, but it looked like she was just staring at them, but not like in a nice way, just in a, in very cold, like a non-emotionless way. And so, yeah, and I think, and she had her arms folded after that.
Yeah, she crossed her arms. Yeah.
But let's dig into that more. As somebody who's followed this trial or this case for 4 years, just about, Shirah, I mean, the whole time, Lori-Vallow has had no remorse. She didn't report her kids missing. So I feel like that's not surprising.
Right. I mean, that's how we got here, right? Was that she never said anything about her kids being missing. And then also, even when, you know, in those first interactions with Nate Eaton when in Hawaii, you know, he's asking her, where are the kids? And she's basically ignoring him, giving one-word answers. So it's kind of pretty consistent. But
or the phone calls.
Yeah.
I mean, the phone calls from her sister, the phone calls from her son, her own son, and she laughs at these questions about, you know, like.
Well, there
laughs
is
at the
one
idea.
photo. I don't know if you saw it. I'm so glad we were allowed to have a still photographer in the courtroom.
Yeah, that was the first
incredible,
time, by the way.
Yeah. Incredible that he allowed that. But in the beginning, before the verdict was read, she was very smiley, actually. Like, she was smiling at her attorneys for a little while there.
Which she's also done before.
Which she has done throughout the whole trial. She's been very laughy and jokey. But then, you know, as we're all walking out, and it's weird because it just felt like this, like that's just it. That's all there is. And so everyone got up, and I look at a Fremont County Sheriff's Office detective, I think, and he kind of like looked up in the air and just put his hands in his pockets and sighed, and I gave him a look and like are you okay? And he just raised his eyebrows and shrugged, and like that he walked away. And then I saw Kay Woodcock, JJ Vallow's grandma, just beeline for Ray Hermosillo, who is the detective that made the first welfare check for looking for JJ, and then also helped discover the kids' bodies. She just exploded into tears, just hugging him and like, you know, crying in his suit, like thank you. And then she beelined for Rob Wood, who gave the closing arguments on behalf of the prosecution. She was crying. He looked very emotional. People walked up to shake his hand. You know, people were very thankful. But it was like just a eruption of emotion. Like, you walk out in that hallway and people are just drenched in tears, people just crying, and people that, you know, don't even know any of the families personally, still crying. I mean, even outside the courthouse, people crying when they're hearing the verdict on their phones. People just exploded with emotion.
Yeah, and you were both out there.
Yeah, and actually prior to that, you mentioned Rob Wood and Ray Hermosillo, detective.
Yeah, wasn't he pacing in the hallway?
Morgan and I were in the hallway of the courtroom before the verdict was read, and they were both pacing up and down the hallway.
Yeah.
Multiple times. I couldn't even count how many times they were pacing back and forth. And I remember asking, like, are you ready for this? And they were like, I don't know.
And how do you
see.
prepare for that?
Right.
And we talked, Jean Fisher was on set with us on Friday, and she talked about like that moment when you have done all that you can. The decision has been made. There is nothing you're going to do to change it at that point. But that anticipation and that weight is agonizing.
And how much it weighs on law enforcement. I mean, I want to make sure that we are giving them the credit that they deserve throughout this case, because from Fremont County to Rexburg down to Maricopa County, Arizona, to even the Utah Medical Examiner, all these officials that have been involved, everybody out in the FBI, everybody in Ada County. I mean, this has been really difficult, and even Kay and Larry acknowledging that the law enforcement officers in this case saw things that nobody should ever have to see in their entire life.
They can't unsee it.
They can't unsee it. That's what Larry was saying.
And he said they're like family now. You know, that there are people that will be a part of their lives, that, you know, part of this investigation, that will be a part of their lives forever.
I mean, like even Lindsay Blake walking down after lunch with the police. And honestly, I saw her in the elevator, which is funny. Like, I caught the elevator with her and another officer, and I looked at him and I said, "Are you nervous?
Yeah.
Are you ready?" And she said, "It's all in the hands of the jurors, and we will have to be okay with whatever they choose."
Sure.
Which is a really, really fair and neutral point for a prosecutor to make.
Yeah.
So, and they got what they sought for.
Outside the courtroom, we'll talk about that, I think, outside the courthouse, where there were so many spectators. I talked to a couple gals who, one of them was selected for jury duty in this case. She got let go in essentially the final round before they whittled it down to their 18. And she said she showed up outside the Ada County Courthouse because she just wanted to see it through. She said, I want to know what came of this. She'd heard about the case a little bit before, probably a reason she wasn't chosen, right? But she was like, I want to see this through. And the more I learn about this case, the more I want a guilty verdict. And then another gal whose husband had gotten through a lot of the rounds of jury selection as well. And she was really emotional. And so Shirah and I were there as while people in the courtroom were having to stay very orderly, people outside the courtroom
screaming,
crying, sobbing. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because a lot of those people, I'd say the majority of the people who came out to the courthouse, I mean, they've never met Kay and Larry Woodcock. They've never met Lori-Vallow. They've never met any of the people involved in this case, but yet they've followed it so closely and the trajectory of everything. And so they feel like they know these people, or maybe they just resonate with it. And so, and we saw that, there was cheering, there was crying, there was
signs,
so many signs.
Lori,
Lori.
Yeah. And also I talked to a woman who we had on our newscast who was, I noticed her, the reason I approached her is because she was so emotional. And I walked up to her and I said, will you do an interview with us? Why does this affect you? And she's like, I went to school in Rexburg. I have deep ties to Rexburg, as do a lot of people here in the Valley, because it's a predominantly LDS community over in Rexburg, or a lot of places in Eastern Idaho. And a lot of people from the LDS faith moved here. And so there's a lot of connections. I mean, how many people do we know in our lives that went to BYU Idaho? And it's honestly very, it hits home for a lot of people that are like, I understand this kind of sect of Mormonism, and many people that fall into that extreme kind of, in truth, cultish mentality in that thinking. And this woman also saying, I've got kids. This hits home for parents.
That's a big part of it is that it does involve 2 children, right?
Yeah.
It's not just, grand scheme of things, a lot of people involved in this, but the children aspect of this, I think, really hit home for a lot of people just in the beginning when they were first missing. And then as you follow along the case, it's like one development after another, and it's just.
And as a mom of 4 kids, thinking there are absolutely times I've said my children are demons, or save me from them. No doubt that's happened, and at no point ever did that really mean, that I expected someone to harm them. And so there is an element that you connect with, just like we've talked with people in the LDS faith. There is an element that you connect with, and yet also something that you absolutely say, that is not what I'm talking about. And that is something completely different than my experience.
And I think it's important to point out those kind of connections, that relevancy is why also there was a lot of national media attention on this case from the get-go. And there hasn't been a lot of media attention throughout this case every day of trial. There was a little bit in the beginning, jury selection a tiny bit, and then opening statements. But that last day when that verdict was read,
it was an explosion.
It was a zoo. It was a circus out there with media. And it's because Nate Eaton put it so perfectly when I interviewed him. This has got all the elements of a story that people are interested in. Sex, money, extreme religion, power, children, all these awful things that I think have captivated the nation, and people wanted to see the outcome.
And a woman who on the surface had all of the things going for her and really, was the quintessential
she was
queen.
On Wheel of Fortune.
Yeah, exactly.
She had,
Pageant queen.
She was in pageants. I mean, Chad even said, "I want your workout plan. Like, I want."
Sure.
And she, it's
and
just
even a
so
devoted
bizarre.
mom. I mean, we heard that on the stand. Is that a sweet, devoted mom?
Yeah, time after time.
And that's what they said in closing.
At some point.
That's what the defense said in closing. I mean, there were a few things I thought were interesting. We should talk about closing.
Yeah, for sure.
Closing arguments happened last week, and that's essentially what the jurors are left with, closing arguments from both the prosecution and the defense. And they're saying, here's everything you heard. We're going to tie it with a bow, and this is what we're delivering. Think about this. And the defense repeatedly said there is nothing that ties Lori specifically to saying, kill my kids, I killed my kids, I want my kids dead, except for the text messages, I think, kind of allude to that with her and Chad that were presented a couple weeks ago. But they also said people have testified, Summer, her sister, and Colby, to the fact that Lori was a good mom and a caring mom. And of course, people can change. But I'm curious from your perspective with closing, like, was it even a solid case?
Well, it was really interesting because they brought up all these things. She's a great mom, whatnot. But then they also, that was the first time we actually heard them kind of put Chad, blame him.
Thrown under the bus.
It was extreme.
I mean, throughout the whole 5 weeks, we never heard anything about Chad being responsible for, Lori, and her transformation, if you will. But in the end, the defense
She
brought
was
it.
manipulated. She was a
Yeah.
follower.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Chad was the leader. That they go, Chad couldn't even sell enough stupid books
Yeah.
about
Yeah,
the
I
end of
did
the
see
world.
that, yeah.
And all of us were like, oh my gosh.
They brought up his looks, compared him to Charles
Yeah.
Vallow.
Yeah,
So
why
Charles
would you
is a
ever
good
trade
looking
down?
guy. Why
Yeah.
would you trade
Yeah.
down instead of trade up? Like, and you know, I think that was like a really good way to just like relate to an average person.
Yeah.
But then again, and also like Lori seemed like out of her mind during this part, because she was, you know, talking to John Thomas. She seemed agitated when Chad was brought up, and also when Archibald called her a follower, she seemed agitated, and it
She
seems
was
like
like, no, I'm a leader. I'm a warrior.
something
Yeah.
along
Yeah.
those lines. Like I mean, I can't interpret it, but she seemed very agitated, frustrated. And it was very clear, and I don't know what John Thomas told her, but he whispered to her something, and she calmed down a little. But then again, it's like, we were all waiting to see what their defense was going to be, right? But they didn't call anyone.
They didn't call
so
any
this
witnesses.
was their defense.
Right, exactly.
This was it.
Yeah.
It was to blame Chad and say
Yeah.
she was manipulated, and just hope that the jury has sympathy for her because the motion for acquittal didn't go through. That's what it was.
And we didn't hear that in the opening statements. And
No.
so that's
No.
also interesting because it makes me wonder if, I mean, they obviously have discovery. So everyone knows, the defense knows the case that's going to be presented.
Right.
So this isn't a surprise to them. But it does make me wonder if they didn't feel like that testimony somehow weighed heavier on the jurors, and that they made this little bit of adjustment
At the end.
At the
Yeah.
end.
Yeah.
Because it is, I mean, you would think you would have heard that right up front. Usually you do. And so it's an interesting question of how they decided to go about that way. And you're right, they were very clear about like follower. And it makes me wonder that if she believes all of the things that we've heard, is that offensive to her? I mean, if she's doing something that she
Probably.
feels is the right
Yeah.
thing to do in order to, get her salvation, is it almost like, no,
I do believe this. Chad didn't manipulate
Chad
me.
didn't, we did this together, or we're
Yeah.
in this together.
Right.
you know.
Perhaps.
And
And
the
she didn't
prosecution
testify.
actually came back and they said, you know what, you can't say that, you can't pin it all on Chad, because we have text messages
Yeah.
showing that, Chad would say, oh, this person is dark, and Lori would come back and say, no, I think they're light, 4 whatever number light. And then Chad would be like, oh, yeah, you're right, oh, my bad,
Yeah.
And so you can't, the prosecution came back and said, you can't do that. Also, to call her a good mom, like a good mom doesn't go
They did
venture
say that.
off to
Yeah.
Hawaii and never report her kids missing.
Right.
Exactly.
So-
There's a lot of holes you can poke, but I think it is interesting, like you said, this is all they had. And maybe
Yeah.
their story changed, but they barely cross-examined any of the witnesses throughout the 5 weeks of trial. They didn't present any witnesses of their own. Lori herself didn't testify. So we were all kind of anxiously awaiting what their case would be, and it just wasn't really anything earth-shattering. And it makes you wonder, too, how much she was cooperating with them
Yeah.
throughout the case, you know?
Yeah. Well, and Jean Fisher pointed out that she said, it really is up to the defendant to determine, the attorneys have to make they have to make choices, they have to make decisions, but really it is up to the defendant to kind of guide how a case goes and how a case is presented. So,
Because at the end of the day, she's still their client.
right,
Exactly.
for sure.
So-
I mean,
Exactly.
they're working for her on behalf of the
Right.
yeah, exactly.
And the prosecution taking essentially before the defense's closing arguments, saying all the evidence you heard, the geolocation information, the cell phone records, text messages, the hair from Lori
DNA.
Vallow that was found on duct tape on the plastic bag wrapped around JJ's Vallow's body when his body was found in a shallow grave on Chad's property. Take all these things and
Yeah.
remember everything you heard. Although it wasn't chronological, remember all these witnesses who testified. Take their credentials, because witness testimony is evidence.
Yeah.
And the jurors can say, I believe this witness or I don't believe this witness, Zulema to Ray Hermosillo to all these people we heard from. And then they say, okay, I'm going to take that all as fact. What's not fact are attorney statements. So, opening statements, any of the things that the attorneys said in their questioning of the witnesses, they don't take that, but they take anything the witnesses said, any of the photos presented, text messages, and they say, look at all this and tell me that there is no indication that lori-vallow was not involved. She didn't necessarily,
Right.
we may never know who killed
Right,
who.
right.
We may never know who killed Tylee and JJ and Tammy,
Sure.
but we know Lori was involved, and that was their kind of closing.
Yeah.
which is almost like kind of frustrating in the
It
end,
is. I agree.
because people say they want justice and they want answers, and it's like the family still might not get that. The family
Right.
still might not get the solid. And do they want it? I don't know. But it's like,
Sure.
to know every detail of what happened, it's just not there. Especially with Tylee, like she, they couldn't determine how she died because
Right.
there wasn't anything left of her. Like there's just some things you are not going to know.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating.
Right.
Yeah.
But the state can only do the best they can do with what they have. And that's the thing. They said, this is a lot of circumstantial evidence. You can still convict someone on circumstantial evidence. Like the defense saying, hey, nothing directly ties her to this. Like she has never said, I want my kids dead, or
A hair should be on a kid's
or
body or
right,
pajamas.
right. But keep in mind, that's not what circumstantial evidence is.
Yeah.
And you can very well convict somebody on that. And I believe that was the case here.
Yeah,
I agree.
for sure.
I talked with Tylee's aunt, Annie Cushing, right after that verdict was read, and she said, going into the verdict, she actually felt kind of peaceful and like calm because she was in court the first 2 weeks, and then after that, she's just been following along. And she was saying, after that first week, when we saw those photos of JJ and Tylee and heard those details, like she believed at that moment, like the jury was going to convict Lori-Vallow from there. And then, things were just coming through. So she felt, kind of
At peace
ready
or,
for it. Yeah.
Confident in it.
Yeah. And so, and then after, when the verdict did come down, she too was elated. She said she was over the moon. But at the end of the day, she said, in a case like this, she doesn't feel like you'll ever get closure, no matter what,
right.
because every little thing, even like the sky or the sunset, will remind her of Tylee.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and you notice that even with Woodcocks, they were jubilant. They were, celebratory in the beginning. And then by the end of that, press conference that they held, they stood outside of the courthouse and talked to reporters. And by the end, they were in tears and, of course, talking about missing JJ. And that's never going to go away.
It's never going to bring them back.
Mixed emotions.
Like, this will never, ever bring them back.
Right.
It's like, and what's interesting is the defense in their closing said convicting Lori will not bring the kids back.
Which is true.
Which is also true.
Sure.
But then just in, both ways, it's like, how much does justice comfort you from their perspective? Like, how much does a guilty verdict comfort you? How much does evidence and testimony comfort you when you're just not ever going to see your grandkids again?
Right.
I think that's become their identity, right? That's become a lot of the family members that have been vocal. That's been their identity. So they have, of course, they're not ever going to come to terms with the fact what happened, but they have turned that sorrow into sort of like this fight and this campaign to be the voice for these people who lost their lives. So for Kay and Larry, this is sort of the fight that they were fighting, and they got that resolution. However, they did say this is far from over.
Absolutely. I was going to say,
This
now
is
they're
far
still
from over.
already looking into the next case, right? So they will be at sentencing, and we know that's going to
Within
happen.
3 months,
in a few months, and they'll have to do a pre-sentence investigation, which they always do before a sentencing like this. So it'll be an intense investigation. They will talk to Lori. Pre-sentence investigators will talk to Lori. They will really examine every bit of her history, criminal history, but also just social history,
Family, education,
mental health, physical health,
Huge.
Her stability, her mindset, where she is with all of this, her risk to the community, her risk to other people. I mean, that will be a huge report that will be given to the judge as he goes into sentencing. And then at the sentencing hearing, we will likely hear those victim impact statements. And that will be incredibly emotional. They usually are. Yeah. And you would expect to hear from the Woodcocks then, along with a lot of other people that we have heard from throughout this trial. And of course, both in the testimony, but also just people who have been in the courtroom and watching. Wouldn't be surprised if we don't hear from them. And so that will be a big deal. And then they also have Chad Daybell's trial, assuming that he doesn't take a plea agreement of some sort, which is going to be a question.
It's been a looming question because, I mean, when sitting through all of the evidence against Lori, Chad's name was attached to every single one of it. And obviously we know that because he's considered her co-conspirator.
And the bodies were found on his property.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
But just, I mean, from what we saw against Lori, it's almost hard to imagine how this can be fair enough for Chad, how we can see a fair trial for Chad. And thinking, would you be smarter to plead out, or would you be smarter to go to trial, or would you, how do you determine that in this scenario? And it's kind of interesting now that his stuff is pushed back because he didn't wait, or he waived his right to a speedy trial. She did not. So she got her speedy trial. Like, when we tried talking to John Pryor, his attorney, and he said, I won't tell you what my client's going to do or not. And it's also a question of, is he watching Lori's trial? Is he?
Sure, yeah.
But we know John Pryor was.
I mean, he was there every day. Every day, from jury selection on to closing arguments.
And you would be a good attorney to do that, though. I mean, you would be a smart attorney
and obviously it's his right to, right? Everyone is, they have the right to watch this trial too. But I mean, you know, it'll be interesting to see what happens from there.
I can't see how this verdict helps his client.
I don't think so.
Okay, but interestingly, I asked Jean this question probably a few weeks ago as we were nearing the end of evidence, and she said, we're in it. Right? The people, you guys watching, are in it. You care. You're still going to find jurors in Ada County, the state's largest county, that still don't know about this case. I have people in my life that don't know. You're not taking these same 18 jurors and having them try Chad.
Right.
So that's why this trial moved to Ada County. That's why Chad Daybell's trial will be here. They're severed, as was decided earlier this year. But you're probably, no doubt, you're going to find people that still didn't follow Lori's trial.
And we saw that too in jury selection. Some people, I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of them, but there were some people who said, I've never heard of Lori-Vallow before.
Exactly.
Also, I mean, now that John Pryor knows what the prosecution has, he now has time too to find a defense for Chad.
And I think when I say it's not going to help his client, I think what I'm talking about is it is on his property. So I think if you had to look at where's the reasonable doubt going to lie, I think it's with Lori.
And I think
I don't know if Chad has that same.
The strongest case too against him, I think, is, I mean, obviously the cell phone records located him and Alex Cox.
Was it the
with
raccoon
the bodies.
text?
The raccoon text about the limbs and the burning, but also Tammy.
Right.
And the fact that he was the only one there. I mean, Alex maybe, right? Alex is dead. We don't know. But that's his wife who died in the middle of the night in his bed. He made up, or he said what happened in the hours leading up to her passing away. And it was announced died by homicide by asphyxiation. So who cut off that oxygen to her? How did she die? You know, nobody else was really there that we know of.
If you tried to say it wasn't me, then do you not have to? Then isn't somebody not going to want to know? Then who was it? Because you were there.
Because that's the next question.
So then was it Alex?
Right.
Yeah. And also important to point out, I think for folks at home that don't know, death penalty off the table with Lori-Vallow because the prosecution had filed discovery too late, and they had decided that only within a couple months leading up to the trial.
Exactly.
But Chad Daybell, death penalty is still on the table. However, it would be interesting to see what happens because it is off for Lori, whether or not the defense files any motions to take it off solely based on the fact that it was off the table for Lori. It's not fair then to have it on the table for Chad. So I'll be curious to see what happens with that.
And if it stays on too, that makes finding jurors even harder. That process also is a more difficult
because
process.
those same, I mean, provided that we go to trial and Chad doesn't plead out and does get the death penalty, hypothetically, those same jurors in the trial will then have to be part of a penalty phase where they will decide whether or not to give him the death penalty if that does happen. So it's just like the longest process, and rightfully so. But next year is when he's supposed to have his trial if he doesn't plead, and we just don't know what will happen with that. And also in Arizona, Lori is still, she is facing charges. She was indicted on conspiracy to commit murder of Charles Vallow, her previous husband, who was shot and killed by her brother, Alex Cox.
Who's now dead also.
Who is now dead.
A lot to follow.
And so she was indicted on those, but that was on hold because, of everything that happened here. So they're waiting for this to get over. They're also waiting for sentencing to happen in Fremont County, which she has been transported to Madison, awaiting her sentencing. So once that happens, Arizona can extradite her to face these charges and then formally file those. She'll get a case number, all of these things, be held in Arizona while this plays out. And then could sentence her if she's found guilty. And then, from there, it's
and Maricopa County has said that they are planning on doing that. So they're just waiting to see what happens. There have also been charges that have been brought forth, I believe, in Brandon Boudreaux's as well, in connection to his attempted shooting as well. So a lot to still unravel in this.
And I think most prosecutors will continue the case because anything can happen on appeal. I mean, if there is a case to be made, they're not going to not make it, assuming that, well, she's just going to be in prison in Idaho.
Well, that is interesting, though, because she faces life in prison. I mean, conspiracy alone carries that sentencing. And so she faces life in prison for all these guilty counts. And so if she's found guilty in Arizona, she's already facing, if she's sentenced to life in prison, hypothetically.
But then if something happens and you appeal, right? So then on an appeal, let's say the conviction's overturned.
Drop it.
Right. So then, I mean, then you're looking at statute of limitation issues in Arizona potentially. So I think the idea is essentially do the process, go through the process. If there's a case to be made and there's justice to be had, let's do that. And then if she were in life, if she were sentenced to life and that stood here in Idaho, likely Arizona would simply move her back to Idaho and she would serve those sentences concurrently at the same time, or if they decide to do that a consecutive, what I would have to see is I'm not sure that you could do that in two different states. I think in Idaho they could choose to sentence on different charges. They can choose to serve concurrently or consecutively. They can choose to sentence that way. I don't think in another state that's how that works.
That you can lump them onto each other.
I'll have to check that.
Okay.
But that would be, the idea. But I think that was what would be the fear would be if Arizona didn't do that, then what happens if these convictions are overturned or something else happens or someone gets out on parole, that kind of thing.
That makes sense.
Then,
better safe than sorry.
Exactly. They want to make sure that that's basically on the record.
Okay, that makes sense. So awaiting her sentencing.
Yep.
Within the next 3 months. She's currently in the Madison County detention facility because that's where they house women for Fremont County. These charges are all in Fremont County. The crimes occurred. We can now say they occurred, not allegedly, right? They occurred in Fremont County, and then we'll wait for that sentencing. And then, like you said, Chad Daybell's trial, we're expecting June of 2024, but that could change as well.
Absolutely. And we will continue to keep you apprised of what's going on. We'll keep you updated on this trial, of course, on KTVB.com, on the air, and here and inside the courtroom.